The Civil War in the United States began in 1861, after decades of simmering tension between northern and southern states over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 caused 7 southern states to secede and form the Confederate States of America. 4 more states soon joined them. The war between the states, as the Civil War was also known, ended in Confederate surrender in 1865. The conflict was the costliest and deadliest war ever fought on American soil, with some 620,000 of 2.4 million soldiers killed, millions more injured, and much of the South left in ruin. Hey, what's up, Jamma School? Mama Jamma here, and welcome back to another episode of History Time. Today we are going to be going over the Civil War in the United States of America. As I just read, the United States Civil War was between the Union and the Confederate States over the ownership of slaves, states' rights, and westward expansion. This was, like I also read, one of the most deadliest war ever fought on American soil. However, it was not the last war ever fought on American soil, and we'll get to that in a different video. But without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? We're going to start off with the background of the Civil War. In the mid-19th century, while the United States was experiencing an era between tremendous growth and fundamental economic differences existed between the northern and southern regions of the country. And by that, it means that there were different. It was the northern states were more economically stable. They were more advanced. They had a larger industry within their economy, which allowed them to grow a lot quicker than the southern states. The North had their manufacturing industry was well established, and the agriculture was mostly limited to small scale farms. To the South's economy, which was largely based on the labor of slaves. And one thing I want to mention, when a lot of people say that it was only black slaves, that is completely incorrect. Yes, a very large majority of them were a large majority of slaves were black, but there were slaves from all over the country. There were Irish slaves, which were treated a lot worse than black slaves. There were Mexican slaves. All of this, there were numerous types of different slaves, and it was terrible regardless. But that's just something I wanted to point out, that it wasn't, not all the slaves were black. This was their economy was largely based, like I said, on the backs of slaves, of slave labor, and they would grow certain crops like cotton and tobacco, like you've read in your history books. Growing abolitionist sentiment in the North of the 1830s and Northern opposition to slavery extension into the new Western territories led to many Southerners to fear that the existence of slavery in America, and thus the backbone of their economy, was in danger. So, when people say that the Civil War was completely and totally about keeping slaves, they're both wrong and right. They're right in the sense that the southern economy was largely based off of slave labor, and if they were to abolish slavery, the South wouldn't have any really much going for them. The southern states would be in a large economic and financial crisis until they were able to catch back up with the northern states, which at the time had made extraordinary strides in the manufacture and labor department. But they're also wrong in the sense that it was about states' rights. At the time, um, slavery was still a state right. It was in the Constitution at the time, therefore, it was technically a constitutional right to have slaves. Now, that's not me saying that it was a good thing. I'm hardcore against slavery. I think it was a terrible thing in world history, not just American history, world history. But at the time, it was a constitutional right to own a slave or slaves. And at the time, only white men could afford to own slaves. That's because they came over from England, very wealthy, built up these massive plantations, and were very successful. But it was a constitutional right, therefore it was a state right in the South, and the southern states feared that that the abolishment of slavery was an infringement on their constitutional and state rights. In 1854, the U.S. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which essentially opened all new territories to slavery by asserting the rule of popular sovereignty over congressional edict. Pro- and anti-slavery forces struggled violently in Bleeding, Kansas, while opposition to act in the North led to the formation of the Republican Party, a new political entity based on the principle of opposing slavery's extensions into Western territories. After the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case of 1857 confirmed the legality of slavery in the territories, the abolitionist John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 convinced more and more Southerners that their northern neighbors were bent on the destruction of the political institution that sustained them. Lincoln's election in November 1860 was the final straw, and within 3 months, 7 southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had seceded from the United States. So, there's a lot to take in on that. This is basically saying that there was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which created Kansas and Nebraska. They became states. They became territories technically, but they're states. And the North and South both wanted these states. The North, extremely anti-slavery, wanted that to keep slaves out of it, but the southern states wanted so that way they could grow their slave labor economy and be able to stay in touch with the northern states, basically, or be able to keep up with them, which led to violent fights and battles for the territory. This is before the Civil War. This was known as Bleeding, Kansas. Bleeding Kansas eventually led to the formation of the Republican Party, who were politically against slavery. They were extremely opposed to slavery, so they were the Union. And this all led to the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which, like it says, convinced more and more Southerners that their state rights and constitutional rights were being infringed upon. This led to the secession of the 7 states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And that, of course, led to 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War. Once Lincoln took office in March of 1861, Confederate forces threatened the federal-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. On April 12th, after Lincoln ordered a fleet to resupply Sumter, Confederate artillery fired the first shots of the Civil War. Sumter's commander, Major Robert Arnson, surrendered after less than 2 days of the bombardment, leaving the fort in the hands of the Confederates under Pierre G.T. Beauregard. 4 more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy after Fort Sumter. Border slave states like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland did not secede, but there was much Confederate sympathy among their citizens. So, once Lincoln took office, and not even once he took office, as he was taking office, he was barely into his term, the Confederate states were immediately like, no, fuck you, these are our states' rights. Even though, like I said, it's a terrible slavery is a terrible thing. They believed back then that it was their states' rights. It was their constitutional rights. They were fighting for their constitutional rights, and they immediately went to make a statement, and that led to them taking Fort Sumter in a matter of 2 days. Though the surface of the Civil War may have seemed a lopsided conflict with the 23 states of the Union and an enormous advantage in population, manufacturing, and railroad construction, the Confederates had a strong military tradition, along with some of the best soldiers and commanders in the nation. They also had a cause they believed in, preserving their long-held traditions and institutions, chief among these being slavery. They were basically, like I said, they were fighting to keep slavery, because it was, like I said repeatedly, it was their rights at the time. It was a state right. It was a constitutional right at the time, until Abraham Lincoln took all that away. But we'll get to that. It was a state right. This was what they believed in. They believed in their right to have slaves. People in the beginning, it appeared that the Union was going to be an easy victory for the Union, because they had almost double the amount of states fighting for them and a much larger population to fight with, or to fight the Confederate States. But as we've seen before World War II, where Japan was taking on China, quantity doesn't necessarily mean everything. A lot of times, quality will surpass quantity. If you guys don't know, we'll talk about it when we get to World War II. But in World War II, Japan went and decided that they were going to take China because they thought they were inferior to them. So they wanted to conquer all of Asia and all that stuff. They basically slaughtered the Chinese, and the Chinese had a much larger population and army than them due to their large population size. But the Japanese, they had a much higher quality in weaponry. They had much higher quality in military training. So this was the same case here. The Union might have had a much larger population, but the Confederates had more well-trained soldiers, some of the greatest minds in military history. So you can see how that kind of evens things out. In the first battle of Bull Run, known in the South as First Manassas, I think that's how you say it. On June 21st, 1861, 35,000 Confederate soldiers under the command of Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, forced with a greater number of Union forces, or Federals, to retreat towards Washington, D.C., dashing any hopes of a quick Union victory and leading Lincoln to call for 500,000 more recruits. In fact, both sides' initial call-up for troops had been winded after it became clear that the war would not be a limited or short conflict. So, like I said, quantity doesn't necessarily beat quality. The Confederates went in with 35,000 soldiers, and forced um, a much larger number of Union troops to retreat to Washington, D.C., which is when the Union eventually realized, oh shit, these guys are going to be tough to beat. We need more men. So they called up 500,000 more people. Um, this leads to the Civil War in Virginia. Um, George B. McClellan, who replaced the aging General Winfield Scott as Supreme Commander of the Union Army after the first months of the war, was beloved by his troops, but his reluctance to advance frustrated Lincoln. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally led his army up the Potomac, up the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, capturing Yorktown on May 4th. The combined forces of Robert E. Lee and Jackson successfully drove back McClellan's army in the 7 days battle from June 25th to July 1st. And a cautious McClellan called for yet more reinforcements in order to move against the Richmond. Lincoln refused and instead withdrew the Army of the Potomac to Washington. By mid-1862, McClellan had been replaced as the Union's general-in-chief by Henry W. Halleck, though he remained in command of the Army of Potomac. So, this General McClellan, or McClellan, yeah, he was beloved. His troops loved him. He was a great general. He treated them right. He was charismatic, as a general should be. But none of that led to him advancing any troops to fight the war, which infuriated Lincoln. So this eventually led to McClellan leading his troops up into Yorktown, only to be met with a combined force from Robert E. Lee and Jackson, and they were drove back in the 7 days battle. McClellan called for more reinforcements, but Lincoln declined and told them to retreat back to Washington, D.C. Due to this and many of the other things that he did, like not advancing or not trying to really do anything with his position, he was taken out of the commander-in-chief, or the general-in-chief, of the Union Army, but he did remain in command of the Army of Potomac. General Lee then moved his troops northward and split his men, sending Jackson to meet Pope's forces near Manassas, while Lee himself moved separately with the second half of the army on August 29th. Union troops led by John Pope struck Jackson's forces in the Second Battle of Bull Run. The next day, Lee hit the Federal left flank with a massive assault, driving Pope's men back towards Washington. On the heels of his victory in Manassas, Lee from Lincoln and Halleck, or Lee began the first Confederate invasion of the North. Despite contradictory orders from Lincoln and Halleck, McClellan was able to reorganize his army and strike back at Lee on September 14th in Maryland, driving the Confederates back to a defensive position among the Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg. So again, quality can beat quantity quite a bit. These seasonal generals, they ended up being able to outmaneuver the Union Army. They split their forces. They had Jackson meet Pope's forces head on, while Lee went and surrounded them, attacked their left flank, which ultimately demolished the Union Army, and they were forced to retreat back to Washington, D.C. But McClellan was able to reorganize his army and strike back hard enough to force the Confederates to fall back to the Antietam Creek, where it was basically a game of fuck you, no fuck you, I'm stronger, no you're strong, no I'm stronger, and it was hell. On September 17th, the Army of Potomac hit Lee's forces reinforced by Jackson's, in what what became the bloodiest single day of fighting. Total casualties of Antietam numbered 12,410, and some of 69,000 troops on the Union side, and 13,724 of around 52,000 for the Confederates. The Union victory at Antietam would prove decisive, as it halted the Confederate advance in Maryland and forced Lee to retreat to Virginia. Still, McClellan's failure to pursue his advantage earned him a scorn of Lincoln and Halleck, who removed him from command in favor of Ambrose E. Burnside. Burnside's assault on Lee's troops near Fredericksburg on December 13th ended in heavy Union casualties and a Confederate victory. He was promptly replaced by Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker, and both armies settled into winter quarters across the Rappahannock River from each other. So, the Battle of Antietam, the deadliest battle of the Civil War. The Union managed to win it, forcing Lee and Jackson to fall back into Virginia. But McClellan still did not pursue them with the large advantage that they had, which led him to ultimately be replaced by Ambrose. And he led an assault on Lee's troops, which resulted in just a massacre of the Union troops, and the Confederates won that battle, obviously. So he was then replaced by Joseph Hooker, and this is when the winter started setting in, where they all settled into their winter quarters across the Rappahannock River from each other. Now we get into after the Emancipation Proclamation, from 1863 to 1864. Lincoln had used the occasion of the Union victory of Antietam to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in the rebellious states after January 1st, 1863. He justified his decision as a wartime measure and did not go so far as to free the slaves in the border states loyal to the Union. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation deprived the Confederacy of the bulk of its labor forces and put an international public opinion strongly on the Union side. Some 186,000 black soldiers would join the Union Army by the time the war ended in 1865, and 38,000 lost their lives. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the thing that basically ended slavery. This freed the slaves in the South, which some people would say is kind of a controversial subject, because if the Confederate States seceded, that means they were not technically part of the Union states anymore. Therefore, the president wouldn't really have too much sway, or any sway at all. But apparently he did, which allowed over almost 200,000 slaves to join the Union Army, which proved to be a massive help in the Union. In the spring of 1863, Hooker's plans for a Union offensive were thwarted by a surprise attack by the bulk of Lee's forces on May 1st, whereupon Hooker pulled his men back to Chancellorsville. The Confederates gained a costly victory in the battle that followed, suffering 13,000 casualties, around 22% of their troops, and the Union lost 17,000 men, 15%. Lee launched another invasion of the North in early June, attacking Union forces commanded by General George Meade on July 1st near Gettysburg in southern Pennsylvania. Over 3 days of fierce fighting, the Confederates were unable to push through the Union center and suffered casualties close to 60%. Meade failed to counterattack, however, and Lee's remaining forces were able to escape in Virginia, ending the last Confederate invasion in the North. Also in July of 1863, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi, a victory that would prove to be the turning point of the war in the Western Theater. After a Confederate victory at Chickamauga Creek, Georgia, just south of the Chattanooga, Tennessee, in September, Lincoln expanded Grant's command. and he led a reinforced federal army, including 2 corps of the Army of Potomac, to victory in Chattanooga in late November. Um, so obviously, generally one of the greatest commanders in, generally, but Ulysses S. Grant, one of the greatest commanders, army commanders in U.S. history. He was he was one of the main reasons, if not the sole reason, that the Union was able to get such a push in the war. He was basically the turning point of the war. Once Grant was able to get command of his troops and army and whatnot, he was able to outmaneuver and use the tactics he learned to outmaneuver the Confederate States. So this made Lincoln give Grant a much larger spread of troops, and he then led a strong reinforced federal army into the South. Into the South, technically to the South, at Chattanooga in November. So obviously, Vicksburg and Chattanooga, two of the major turning points in the war, which eventually led to the Union victory. In March 1864, Lincoln put Grant in supreme command of the Union armies, replacing Halleck. Leaving William T. Sherman in control of the West, Grant headed to Washington, where he led the Army of Potomac towards Lee's troops in Northern Virginia. Despite heavy Union casualties in the Battle of the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania, both in May of 1864, at Cold Harbor early June, and the key rail center of Petersburg in June, Grant pursued a strategy of attrition, putting Petersburg under siege for the next 9 months. Sherman outmaneuvered Confederate forces to take Atlanta by September, after which he and some 60,000 Union troops began the famous March to the Sea. Devastating Georgia on the way to capturing Savannah on December 21st, Columbia and Charleston, South Carolina, fell to Sherman's men by mid-February, and Jefferson Davis belatedly handed over the supreme command to Lee, with the Confederate war effort on its last legs. Sherman pressed on through North Carolina, capturing Fayetteville, Bennetville, Goldsboro, and Raleigh by mid-April. So obviously, Ulysses S. Grant was the thing that the Union needed to get a heads up in the Civil War. He used very good tactics, I would say, to take out the Confederates. He used attrition when laying siege to things, which, if you guys don't know what attrition is, it is basically morale and will to fight, basically. He used the war of attrition, like I said, with laying siege. He wouldn't let anybody in or out of the places he was sieging. They would eventually run low on food. Their morale would start to get lowered and lowered, and they would eventually not have the willpower to fight or put up too much of a fight. It was basically a one-sided fight from here on out. Meanwhile, exhausted by the Union siege of Petersburg and Richmond, Lee's forces made a last attempt at resistance, attacking and captured the Federal-controlled Fort Stedman on March 25th. An immediate counterattack reversed the victory, however, on the night of April 2nd and 3rd. Lee's forces evacuated Richmond for most of the next week. Grant and Meade pursued the Confederates along the Appomattox River, finally exhausting their possibilities for escape. Grant accepted Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. On the eve of victory, the Union lost its great leader, the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, assassinated President Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington on April 14th. Sherman received Johnson's surrender at Durham Station, North Carolina on April 26th, effectively ending the Civil War. So, this whole war was going to be based on who had the greater tactics and who had the greatest willpower. Obviously, at the beginning, the it looked like I said, it looked like the Union was going to have a quick and easy victory against the Confederates with more than a shit ton more troops than the Confederates did, along with more states in the Union than the Confederates did. But they learned real quickly that quantity doesn't necessarily mean quality, and quality can beat quantity quite often if used properly. So the Confederates had very seasoned generals and troops alike who were able to use tactics to outmaneuver, outflank, and destroy the Union Army. But the Unions, once General Ulysses S. Grant joined in, he was basically he was the savior of the Union. Honestly, if he never joined up with the Union, the Confederates, I believe, probably would have won the war. So, yeah, Ulysses S. Grant was probably the biggest turning point. He was the savior of the Union, like I said. He was able to outmaneuver and use very good tactics, like his war of attrition, to take over very strategic and necessary points in the war to be able to win the war. But yep, in the end, the Union ended up winning. Slavery was completely abolished in both the Union and the Confederates, therefore making the United States of America whole again. This war will go down in... This war is not a bright spot on U.S. history. Obviously, it's not a bright spot on anybody's history as well. Because nobody wants to be known as the country who at one time was so bad that their own citizens rose up and fought against them. So I mean, it's like I said, it's not a bright spot. It's a very dark spot on U.S. history, but it's part of U.S. history nonetheless. We just have to live up to it, own it, and not go back to it. Realize our mistakes as we do with, as we should with all of our history, and learn from them. So, that's going to be all for this episode of History Time. I hope you guys did enjoy. Please post in the comments below what you guys think of the Civil War, and post any facts that you would like to in the comments about the Civil War. I know I didn't cover all of the Civil War in this, or at least not all the battles, because, I mean, there was the Battle of Gettysburg I didn't do, which was a large one, but I'm trying not to make these videos extremely long, for the sole reason that this topic isn't necessarily intriguing to a lot of people, and by this topic I mean history is not very intriguing to a lot of people, so I try to make it that perfect length for those of you who would love to learn about history, those of you who know about history want to hear my take on it. So I just tried to keep it long enough for you guys to be able to listen to it, or because it's not really something you watch, it's more of a podcast. So I really just kind of make it long enough for you guys to listen to it while you're doing homework, or just kind of hanging out, playing video games or whatnot. So, yeah. Like I said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you have not already, please follow me on Twitter, and that's pretty... Yeah, just follow me on Twitter, because that's really the only thing I have for my channel. I used to have a Tumblr, and I used to have a Facebook, but that's gone now. So, follow me on Facebook. Not Facebook, I just said I don't have a Facebook anymore. Follow me on Twitter for any updates about the channel. I also post some pretty kick-ass tweets Not really kick ass. I just kind of tweet out whatever the fuck I want. If you get offended by it, I don't fucking care. But yeah, follow me on Twitter. Also, if you have not, which you probably haven't because I don't have any patrons on it, but if you would like to, you can donate donate to my Patreon. Link in the description below. It really helps me out. It lets me upgrade my my equipment because right now I'm literally recording with a laptop. So I mean, the most expensive thing I have that I'm using to record right now is my microphone. So I mean, it's I'm in need of some money. But yeah, don't forget to do that. Also, don't forget to check out the RPG Speak Twitter. Go and follow that for any updates on RPG Speak. Also, go check out the RPG Speak channel. Link in the description below to that as well. RPG Speak is coming back very soon, I promise. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is, as always, Cool Mamma Jamma, and I will see you guys later. Stay cool, Jammas. Stay cool.